My colleague Bill Veale on the far right, and then we'll come back to Barbara.
Assume this is working. Most lawyers, when they get invited to speak or come to talk about their resounding victories, and I am here because of the resonance of my legal obliteration. I represented April Gallup against Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld and General Richard Myers. I was called delusional by Denny Chin in the district court in New York. I was sanctioned twice by the Second Circuit, once for suggesting that the existence of John Walker on that panel was improper. Who was John Walker? He was President George Bush's first cousin once removed. And he was there along with Judge Winters and Judge Cabranes to decide whether or not President Bush's appointees had committed mass murder and treason. I was sanctioned twice, and I made a very understandable but an egregious mistake that still stands in the shadows today. And yet I've never been prouder of what I did. And I couldn't have had a greater compatriot in Dennis Cunningham, one of the great civil rights lawyers of our time, from Attica to Fred Hampton to Judy Berry and Darrell Cherney in Oakland. April Gallup was a soldier at the Pentagon, and she was there with her tiny child, went to do some last minute record checking before she delivered her child to daycare. Was the first day back after maternity leave, and she turned on her computer and the place exploded. She managed somehow to save herself and her child and help apparently other people get out onto the lawn, and she survived. She was in the way of the left wing of that 757. If in fact it did hit the Pentagon, she was in the way of that left wing. I don't know how she managed to get out of that building if that were the case, but she did. She went to the hospital and she was treated horribly by operatives from the Pentagon who tried to recruit her to a story which she could not believe. And in the weeks and months and years actually that went from that time, she could not conform her memory to the story that was being told in the newspapers and on television. So we filed a lawsuit on the 15th of December 2008, and we accused Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and General Richard Myers of mass murder and treason for their complicity in these attacks. That lawsuit was dismissed by Denny Chin with more or less the following words: "It is simply not plausible that the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, and other high government officials would commit, who would conspire to enable attacks which led to the death of 3,000 Americans." I maintain that when the judge wrote those words, he abolished the length and breadth of human history. There were three notions that I wanted to say to the Court of Appeals when I argued the appeal from the dismissal. The first was that evil exists in the world. The second was that it is attracted to power. And the third, a notion I didn't think that I would have to say to anybody who wasn't 6 years old or more or less, it has no regard for citizenship. Now, the court was perverse in its dishonesty when it dismissed the case and affirmed that dismissal. And it left out a myriad of facts, and one kernel of fact that I must now relate to you. I'm sure each one of you here knows it, but maybe there's some people out there in the cyberspace who haven't. Who was Norman Mineta? He was the Secretary of Transportation. He was the only Democrat in the cabinet. And he was in the course of a meeting with the Secretary of Transportation of Belgium, I believe at the time, when he had heard that there had been a crash into the North Tower. 15 minutes later or so at 9:03, he was told that he was wanted over the White House because the second tower had been hit. He went over there and he was directed by Richard Clark down into the PEOC, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, where he was told Dick Cheney was there. He arrived in that room, and sure enough, Dick Cheney was there and giving orders. Mineta, in fact, testified to these facts before the 9/11 Commission. He was there for a very short time when he called him a young fellow in uniform, came to the door and put his head in and said, "Sir," to Vice President Cheney, "the plane is 50 miles out," and left the room. He came back in a very short time later and said, "Sir, the plane is 30 miles out," and he left the room. A short time later, he came in and he said, "Sir, the plane is 10 miles out. Do the orders still stand?" And Mineta, as he testified to the 9/11 Commission, said that Cheney whipped his neck around and said, "Of course they still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?" In a very short time, the Pentagon was ablaze. Now, those words appear nowhere in the decisions of Denny Chin in the district court or of the Second Circuit in the various opinions that they wrote there. They excised from history and ignored into oblivion the primary facts that we told about Dick Cheney, because there are only two possibilities about the nature of those orders, and that is the question which is on everyone's mind when they hear the story. What are the orders? Well, there's one possibility, and that is that he gave orders to have the plane shot down. If that were in fact the nature of those orders, we have 240 years of history that tell us what happens when those orders are not followed. There are investigations, there are boards of inquiry, there are courts martial, and at some point or another, there are demotions or there is prosecution and imprisonment. On that day, all of the senior members of the military in this country who had anything to do with 9/11 were promoted. And there was never a board of inquiry within the military. Never. That leaves us with one possibility, and that is that Dick Cheney gave the order to let that plane be, to stand down any defenses that might exist at the Pentagon. And that means that he gave an order one way or another. He gave an order with regard to a principal instrumentality or tool of the crime at the time and the place of that crime that resulted in the devastation that we now know about. Now, when those words and those notions were excised from history by those courts, the Second Circuit particularly, those judges shredded their oaths, threw them on the floor, and had them swept to some corner someplace. The worst judicial malfeasance that I've known of or heard of. Now, I'm sorry that I've now run to the end of my time. I've got a couple, and I make it quick. I say that mistake that I made, which was very excusable, we only charged the Pentagon in our initial complaint because we intended to amend the complaint later on to charge all of New York. When they made the motion to dismiss, we then added all the questions about New York, 60 pages of affidavits. This is a mistake that will not happen again, and we have a plaintiff ready to go. What we need now is what Danny Sheehan has been talking about and what this group here has now created. and that is the grassroots to put together an understanding general among the population that this is an investigation which must go forward. Dick Cheney, and my cry is, don't allow this to be another JFK. These perpetrators, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Myers, and many more, but those three particularly, are alive, they're on television, and they are provably guilty. So I come as an emissary of hope now for those very reasons. Thank you very much.